Hello and welcome. As you'll be aware, Glanbia Ireland require a limit in the growth of milk volumes over peak supply months of April, May and June from next year, resulting from a planning challenge to our new cheese factory in Bellevue. You will recently have received a statement from Glanbia Ireland detailing the peak milk supply volumes for your farm from 2022 to 2024. In this information session today, we will discuss some of the management options that are available to manage milk volumes supplied through the peak months of April to June from next year. Today, we are bringing you a technical message that we in Glanbia Ireland would never have wished to be delivering. However, we welcome the recent decision of the High Court to uphold the decision of An Bord Pleanála to grant planning permission for the new continental cheese plant in Bellevue. To note, any milk that cannot be processed or otherwise utilised on farm is of no value to the Irish dairy industry or to farmers, with the excess volumes of milk potentially adding a cost burden. Just to note, apart from the general management options that we'll go through today, it's important that every farmer assess their own scenario based on their individual allocated peak milk volumes. Every farm is different, and each farmer will need to make management decisions that best fit their particular situation. I will now hand over to Martin Ryan, who will discuss a number of the milk volume management options for peak supply.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks for joining us. I think the primary objective of the discussion today is really to initiate, if you like, the thought process around some of the options that might be considered on farm during those peak months next year and the year after and so on. And first of all, I think it's only fair to say that for many farms, no adjustments will be required. There will be a large cohort of suppliers that will need very minor adjustments and perhaps confined to 1 month or whatever. And then, of course, it's important to realize every farm is different and no one option will fit all. So anything we say here does not necessarily mean it fits specific farm situations, but I think a number of you will actually see them as appropriate depending on your own circumstances. That said, I think it's equally important that in rapidly expanding herds, the choices are challenging, and it may actually require an adjustment to stock numbers or even calf and pattern in those herds. Where such approaches are required, I think it's very important to review the business plan, to engage with advisors, and maybe even in exceptional cases with your lenders and so on. So just moving forward to consider some of the options, and the first one here we're going to draw up is actually feeding milk to calves, whole feeding milk to calves. I suppose you could say it's where we started out from. So feeding whole milk to calves can indeed actually be worthwhile, and they can actually be a good, useful outlet, because calves can consume up to 20% of their own body weight in milk. However, based on research and based on various trials, I would say 15% of body weight is the kind of number you should target if you're actually making a plan. I would also think prolonged milk feeding, based on the data that's there, does actually show quite enhanced performance in terms of daily live weight gain. Now, one word of caution. When you're actually feeding a lot of whole milk, it's important to regulate the speed of intake. And the best way of doing that is through a teat system. And the reasons for that is to, first of all, when milk is offered freely in troughs, sometimes it's drank too quick, put extra pressure on the abomasum, and cause leakage of undigested milk into the small intestine, resulting in scouring and so on. And also the possibility of milk going into the rumen, which we don't want. And the sucking reflex is your best guard against that. So following high milk intakes, rumen would not normally be as well developed as it would where we had restricted milk. And therefore, transition weaning is actually very important to give them the time to readjust to actually going back to work in the rumen and phased out of milk. So just to give you maybe a little bit of data around what actually the impact on the calf side is, this particular trial here was carried out over a 61-day period from day 7 to day 68 of life. And on the left axis here, what we have is the daily live weight gain. And as you will see here, as we move across the bottom, going from 6 litres per day right up to 12 litres per day, our daily live weight gain increases substantially right up to 0.9 kgs a day. And that's an average figure from day 7 to day 68. So quite impressive performance there. In fact, some of the trial work actually shows that those high levels of gain in that pre-weaning period are carried right through to benefits in first lactation, but we'll leave that for another day. Again, I just want to re-emphasize here, the important thing is to regulate the speed of intake through teat, and when you go on high levels of feeding, to use that conventional slow system of transition weaning. So just some of the considerations on your own farm then, I think the first one here is, to calculate the quantity of excess milk you're going to have, how long you're going to have that for. Are we looking at a 1 month, 2 month, or perhaps 3 month period? Then what the age of our calves are relative to that, and what the weaning date might be versus the X amount of excess milk we have. What's our position at housing and indeed feeding facilities? Can we look at it from an indoor or an outdoor perspective? Be mindful that when you get into bigger numbers of calves, higher hygiene is crucial in the house, and that's particularly crucial from the point of view of managing cryptosporidium and coccidiosis. Another factor to consider, and this really determines maybe what calves you might feed that milk to, is the Jonas status of the herd. And if the herd is Jonas positive, you wouldn't, for example, feed it to your replacement heifers because you would actually pass on the Jonas to them. And more likely, your ideal calves for this kind of milk would be your later born, perhaps beef-sired calves in that kind of scenario. So just maybe to put a few numbers around that then and look at actually a real life situation. And here we have a spring calving herd that milked 100 cows in the year 2020. He's going to have an extra 10 cows in 2022 compared to 2020. And bearing in mind, there's an allocated growth rate of 2.5% compound here over the years 2021 and 2022. That's effectively just over 5% when you compound to 2.5. And I suppose when you look at 100 cows and look at 5%, that effectively means that 5 of the cows are catered from the growth and 5 will actually be excess during that peak period. And in this particular farm situation, we're looking at an output per day of about 25 litres across that period. So in other words, that milk of those 5 extra cows that's excess in peak would equate to about 125 litres of milk. Replacement heifers are actually born quite early and would normally be weaned in April or mid-April, probably by the latest. So they may not be an option. But the later born calves here could actually be used to utilise that milk. So in terms of quantity, what would we need? So 12 of those calves fed 10 litres a day in this call out here would actually consume that milk. Not a very big challenge in that regard. So 12 calves, it would mop it up if you like, and put it to useful use. So I just want to move on from there then, and I suppose the next obvious question is, what about feed allowance? People always ask this question and actually always wonder, what is actually the right level of feeding anyway? And I suppose the challenge, first of all, is that almost all dairy cows have a negative energy balance in early lactation. And we're literally up close to 100 days before, they start to gain body weight again, and lactation has leveled off to a point where they're able to eat enough to meet that. So a typical cow during that period would be yielding around 26 litres per day. And that cow would require 18.7 kilograms of dry matter just for maintenance, plus that output. Normally, with good grass growing conditions and good grass quality, she would consume 16 kilos of grass dry matter and perhaps be fed 3 kilos fresh weight of concentrate, or 2.7 of dry matter there. Now, in early lactation, the feed response is generally driven by genetic merit. So the higher genetic merit cows tend to give you a bigger response. And when you pull that kilo of concentrate, then there are other effects in that cow there. So an example here is, and this is from a number of years research, and it's an average figure for high and medium genetic merit cows. For every incremental kilo of concentrate, you're looking at about 1.1 kilo of milk. You're looking at an impact here on fat and protein as well. And the challenge is, of course, when you pull that kilogram from there, some of the energy that was in it will result in a little bit of milk loss, but it'll also result in the cow taking more from her body reserves. And effectively, that's a 50-50 balance. So if you take out a kilogram of feed that would normally provide the energy for 2 litres of milk, the cow will actually substitute for half it off her back, and she'll probably cut back by about a litre a day. So the impact on the milk will not be as big as you'd expect, but there will be an impact on the cow and her body reserves in that particular scenario. Now, one of the other tools, I suppose, or options that might be considered is actually once a day milking, or abbreviated OAD as such. Now, if we look back over the years, what you will find is historically OAD was thought of maybe in a whole lactation perspective. And it was generally driven by, say, labour availability on the farm, lifestyle choices, the daily walking distance of cows, and usually there was a figure there of 2 kilometres as being a kind of trigger point when it made sense to consider once a day. The workload and the farm structure are equally important in that regard. Some people that work off farm as well actually use once a day as an option. Sometimes cow health and energy balance and can be improved substantially by once a day milking. And back even as late as 2018, during the spring fodder crisis, cows that were in poor condition, many farmers used that once a day milking piece to give them a chance to pick up and bridge their own energy gap as such. But historically, most of the work would have been done on the long term. But more recently, there has been quite a bit of work done on short term once a day milking as well, which is actually quite interesting in the context of the discussion we're having here today. So I might just summarize, the historical viewpoint, or what's considered to be, what once a day versus twice a day milking means. And the first thing is on milk volume, you usually get a reduction of 20 to 30% if you persist with once a day across the lactation. That said, the impact here on milk solids is always a bit less than it is actually on milk volume. So you make up a bit there in terms of the economics. There is a breed and cow effect, and some of the work from Massey in New Zealand would suggest a figure of around 25% reduction in volume from Holstein Friesian cows, and as low as 17% on Jersey cross cows. So quite a difference there. There is also an effective duration, and I'll show you a little bit more of that when we actually come to some of the trial work on the short term. And there's a stage of lactation effect. So if it's conducted in early lactation and stopped at an early point, you get a good recovery. If it is later or continued for longer, recovery is less. I suppose the impact on health and fertility is considered to be very large and very positive. And the biggest single reason for that is if you started in early lactation, you're closing that energy balance we discussed earlier in the context of the feed. You're improving fertility as a result. Generally, you raise body condition score by about 0.4, 0.5, and you get an overall improvement in health. However, if you persist throughout the lactation with once a day milking, the typical outcome is an increase in somatic cell count, sometimes actually up to a doubling. Now, all that said, if we go back to short term once a day milking impacts in early lactation, they're not nearly as marked, and they're actually quite suited to later calving cows and to the concerns we might have here. Here what I have is a trial actually done here in Ireland in Moorpark. And what we're looking at is the short-term impact of once a day milking. And that is actually compared for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or 8 weeks in early lactation, compared with the traditional twice a day milking. And I suppose just rather than giving it to you week by week, I think the best thing to do is to look at the impact by the end of week 35 in lactation, for example. And here we had a cumulative yield from those milked twice a day of 5,300. And then if I look at the 4, 6, and 8 week, you can see a gradual increase in impact the longer we sustain once a day milking. And the impact on milk volume here starts off at 4.3% for the 4 weeks, 7.3% for the 6 weeks, and 9.1% for the 8 weeks. Now that's the cumulative by the end of week 35. And there's been no big impacts measured on fertility, somatic cell count, or lameness when we confine that strategy to those short-term measures from 4 to 8 weeks. The big call out here, and I think the one of major interest, will be that by the end of week 35, there was absolutely no significant difference in terms of the numbers on milk solids in cumulative terms. There were small numerical variations, but no significant difference in terms of scientific measurement. So I think that's quite an interesting piece and gives us grounds to really consider this as an option in some herds. So I think my conclusions then on the once-a-day milking piece are, first of all, short-term once-a-day milking is definitely an option for early lactation, and it's definitely best suited to the later calvers. Initially, you will see a reduction of 22-24% maybe on milk volume and 20-23% on milk solids. When you stop, then you come back, you get an immediate increase when you return to twice a day in terms of production. By the end of week 35, you have very little impact on milk solids yield. In fact, no statistical difference. There was, on this short-term approach, there was no significant difference either on somatic cell count, and the cows used in the trial were not selected for based on somatic cell count at all. In fact, there were a good spread of first, second, and subsequent calvers in the mix in the trial, and there was no major impact on fertility or lameness as you might expect with longer-term once-a-day milking. Just some observations that people would have stated from actually milking once a day based on their experience. Now, this would be over the full lactation. The first thing is, if you can at all avoid some high somatic cell count cows, and if you're milk recording, that will help you to identify those. Avoid cows with poor udder attachment, just to protect their longevity. Slow milkers are a little bit of a nuisance if they actually are in that pack, because they'll be coming in with extra milk and slow the process slightly further. On the other hand, over here you have, a well-balanced British Friesian type cow, good udder attachment. That's an ideal cow for once a day. And the other group of candidates then that are ideal for once a day are those late calver cows who are simply not able to meet enough of dry matter at that stage to meet their output requirements. And therefore they will have significant net energy balance. Those are ideal cows here. And by actually going to once a day, you'll actually help to bridge that gap, get them back into cyclicity quicker, and probably find it easier to get them in calf. So in summary then, those kind of crossbred and British Friesian type cows with good udder attachment are your ideal candidates, subject to cell count. The ones you might consider avoiding would be very high output Holsteins or cows with poor udder attachment. And obviously milk recording, where you can exercise it, we'll actually give you the best information to use in doing that. So maybe now just for a second to look at how we might apply that in the herd, or consider how it might be applied. And I think the first thing you have to do with all these is look at your daily calculation, bearing in mind that the allocations you've got by month for April is a 28-day month, May is a 28-day month, and June is a 5-week, 35-day month in your sums, and calculate what your daily output looks like versus what your allowance will be or whatever. And here I've taken 120 cows, milking an average of 26 litres. And I've taken that output right consistently across these three examples. And beneath that here, I've put in an allocation. So in all cases, the allocation is lower than the output, and therefore we have a gap. So, and that gap ranges here from 203 litres per day right up to 390 litres per day. And basically, the question is, how do we actually deal with that? So just in percentage terms, this one is 6.5, and at the higher level here, it's 12.5%. Now, to deliver those reductions in a 120 cow herd, we would need to be milking 30 of them once a day in this example, or 25% of the herd. And if we go over here to the 12.5% reduction, we'd need to be milking half the cows, 60 of those cows, on once a day for that period. Now, that might be 1 month, it might be 2 months, or whatever, or it might be obviously 2.5 or 1.5, depending on how your numbers stack up. But that's kind of the extent of where it might be. So just to summarize then, I suppose where we are here is, first of all, the impact on the feed reduction will be dependent on genetic merit and balancing, reducing output, but also what the impact on the cow herself would be in terms of taking condition from her back, bearing in mind we must get her back in calf as well, and so on. So it's herd specific and needs to be considered in that context. It might also be considered in the context of where grass growth and grass utilization is at any point in time and the quality of that grass. So when it comes back to the milk to calves, then as we discussed earlier, this could well be an option on some farms where the excess is anywhere between 0 and 15% of production. If I go to the once a day milking, I think that could be an option for herds with an excess of anywhere from 5 to 12%. And it's particularly a good option for later calving cows. In fact, it might even make some of the management issues a little bit easier. We also have the option, I suppose, then of combining those. And if we combine the two of those as options, we could well cover a gap of 25% in milk volume here over that peak period if we're caught for, in any particular month, 2 months, or indeed 3 months. And that probably protects then, I suppose, having that milk for the rest of that lactation. So it's something to be really, really considered in that context. If the challenge is bigger than the 25%, that requires a revisiting of the business plan. It may well require a visiting of the stock numbers. It might need to consider calving pattern. And I would say if you already have a split calving pattern, it's not a very major decision. If you're on a spring calving herd or a compact calving, it's probably something that would need very careful planning. And in fact, in that context, any adjustment to calving date in that kind of a herd, I think requires consideration of both the inputs, the labor, grazing, and indeed other infrastructure. And it also requires a one-to-one advisory piece because there's quite a bit of a number of items to be considered there. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is just a quick overview to initiate the thought process. And I will hand you back now to Shane. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Martin, for taking us through the number of options there that's available to manage the milk supply volumes from April next year. As we were saying earlier, folks, it's not the kind of advice we'd have ever wanted to be delivering. However, where we find ourselves at the minute, I think it's important to cover off the options. And thanks for Martin for taking us through the various options there available to manage the milk supply volumes. I think it's important to note that up to 25% of the milk volume can be managed without any need to change calving dates or cow numbers. Although if there is a significant challenge, then those can be options as well with consultation. So look, in addition to the general management options that Martin has taken us through there now, it's important that every farmer assesses their own scenario based on their allocated peak volumes that you will have got in the letter. Every farm is different and each farm will need to make the right management decisions that best fit the particular situation. So to this end, one-to-one conversations with farm advisors will be invaluable to making the right decisions and really important to manage each individual farm situation where the challenge is greater. As usual, further information and support is available from the Glanbia Ireland team, and I expect we will have more detailed webinars on these topics nearer to peak 2022. So I hope you've found this session very useful. Thanks very much for watching and safe farming.
Good job.